Tonight, the future of war and how it's really not so far away. We'll take you into some of the Pentagon's most advanced research programs and explain why there's now a campaign to stop killer robots. Already, drone technology can make war seem like a video game.
The remotely piloted aircraft is not the future of war. It is the here and now. Make no mistake about it. This ain't PlayStation. We are killing people.
Light them up.
Well, that's Hollywood's take anyway. That clip was from an upcoming movie called Good Kill. The main characters are members of the so-called Chair Force, pilots who remotely operate drones from quiet rooms thousands of kilometres from the battlefield. But the movie's not all that remote from what's happening in the real world. The US government says drone strikes make killing more precise and result in fewer casualties, especially for its own soldiers. But civilians are still dying in alarming numbers, leaving some Pakistani children praying for cloud cover.
I no longer love blue skies. I prefer grey skies. The drones do not fly when the skies are grey, and for a short period of time, the mental tension and fear eases. But when the sky brightens, the drones return, and so does the fear.
Well, armed drones are just the beginning. The next generation of killer drones will be able to storm the skies as well as the deep sea, and robots may spearhead infantry attacks. Sound familiar? All right, hang on, we're not ready for the Terminator yet. Humans will remain in charge, at least for now, but things are changing quicker than you might think. Shortly, we'll speak to an American expert on the future of submarine warfare, and then one of the scientists leading the global campaign to stop killer robots. First, Margot O'Neill takes a look at when these killer robots will arrive.
They're already here, although still in the lab and on a leash, and generally not armed. Well, not yet. Humanoid robots are too slow for battle, but you can see where it's going. For instance, why not send them through a door first in urban assaults?
LS3 follow type.
Robotic mules have been developed to lighten the load for infantry and to chase down enemies. After centuries of slaughter, the lure of slashing mass casualties by delegating war fighting to machines is obvious. But there's other reasons they appeal to military commanders. Robots don't get tired or hungry or scared, and they stay on mission. While waiting for robots to become more capable in battle, armies are bringing robotics to create so-called enhanced or augmented soldiers. Exosuits like these can increase strength and endurance. Drugs are also being trialled to elevate mental abilities and reduce the need for sleep. But right now, none of this is even the biggest game changer.
When it comes to the future of war, what if big pieces of hardware, like the ones Australia is planning, the Joint Strike Fighter, the new submarines, what if they miss the point? What if the future is about swarms of small, cheap, disposable drones? Maybe even millions of them.
At a recent Future of War conference in the US, former fighter pilot and drone expert Mary Cummings questioned whether the Pentagon focuses too much on big weapon systems.
Now we have 3D printers, and I have students over a weekend who can build a drone, program a drone. When you can put 1 million drones in the air for, let's just say, a couple of $100,000, and China could easily do that. You have to start thinking about a whole new way of fighting a war when it's not just the big monolithic platforms, but it's these small drones that are very, very cheap that can just keep coming.
There are now highly agile miniature drones. Some that look like birds or insects. But no matter how small, they could carry some kind of weapon.
It can be equipped with incapacitating chemicals, combustible payloads, or even explosives for precision targeting capability.
80 different countries equip their militaries with drones. On top of that, oh, by the way, all sorts of non-state actors have gotten them, everything from groups like ISIS and Hezbollah to paparazzi to farmers, you name it.
An incident at the White House is once again raising major concerns about security.
A drone recently even ended up on the White House lawn. But you can't use a multi-million-dollar missile to shoot down tiny drones. So one option being explored is the use of lasers, like this successful test on a large drone 2 years ago. While expensive to develop, lasers cost just $1 a shot, and they're trying for smaller systems. Drones are spreading not just across the skies, but into the sea, with underwater drones predicted to challenge the role of submarines. The Pentagon is even researching how it could bury launch pods in the deep sea for years at a time, before triggering them to the surface and releasing pre-packed drones. It's when you mix drones with accelerating artificial intelligence capabilities that human control in the decision-making loop starts to shrink, because the sheer speed and processing power of computers outstrips what humans can do. It's already happening.
30 different nations have air defense systems that can detect an incoming missile, or some of them even a rocket or mortar that's coming in so fast that the human reaction speed is basically to get to mid-curse word, oh crap. Instead, the system automatically identifies the target and is able to shoot at the target in the time the human isn't able to react. The human role has changed from being in the loop of decision to, as a U.S. Air Force document put it, being on the loop of decision. That is, we've gone from joysticking it, controlling everything, to now we're managing them. Stealthy drones that can do things like take off and land on their own, fly mission waypoints on their own, ID targets on their own. But we've not been able to put it all together into one whole, carry out the entire mission on its own. But that's coming.
But artificial intelligence still has a way to go.
Computer recognition right now is at the space where if you show it an image of R2-D2, the most advanced recognition system today will come back and say it's a stapler. Mistakes will happen. Oh, by the way, guess what? Humans make mistakes in war too.
And then there's hacking, because software will become the military's nervous system. If you hack into it, you could turn a weapon back on its own.
The ultimate co-option is recode all American systems as Chinese systems and recode all Chinese systems as American systems. A human pilot would say, that makes no sense, I'm questioning that order. A computer, if you have the right access, will follow that instruction.
Future war expert Peter Singer has co-written a novel imagining what armed conflict could look like between China and the US.
Unlike a World War II, we'll see battles in these two new places, in outer space and cyberspace. And whoever wins those battles, whoever controls the heavens, so to speak, and by that I mean the communication satellites, the surveillance satellites, the satellite navigation, the GPS, all of the wars on land and air and sea depend on that. The same thing goes for cyberspace. Whoever controls it, or just whoever is able to control access to it, is going to dominate the physical fight.
It begs the question, is Australia ready for this kind of war?
An Australian parliamentary committee is currently examining the potential use for unmanned vehicles or drones for the Army, Navy and Air Force. And Australia's defence strategy is also being reviewed.
But one of the Defence Department's own consultants believes the ADF is lagging badly behind.
When it comes to the future of warfare, the Australian Defence Force is at least 15 to 20 years behind the United States. Right now, Australia's focusing on sort of last generation weaponry. By the time we get our new order of submarines, whether it's a Japanese sub or some other design, They will be outdated, they'll definitely be outdated. Australia needs to be thinking about the next generation of warfare and the fact that our enemies are already deploying highly sophisticated drone technologies. So we need to have drones in the air, under the water, and on ground as well, mobile systems.
The fear is that we might be arming ourselves for yesterday's war.
Well, Bryan Clark is a former US nuclear submariner who served as a top aide to the Chief of Naval Operations. Earlier this year, he wrote a new report for the Pentagon called The Emerging Future in Undersea Warfare, which looks at the new challenges facing traditional submarines. He's also a senior fellow at the Centre for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and he joins us now in our Washington studio. Thanks for being there, Bryan Clark.
You're welcome, Tony. It's good to see you, and thanks for having me on.
Now, the big problem facing the next generation of submarines, even the quietest of them, is what some people are now calling the transparent ocean. What is that?
So what we're seeing is a trend with the advent of big data and the ability to take a look at large areas and amass a large amount of information at one time and then process it very quickly, is new detection techniques are emerging that would allow you to find large man-made objects in the water more easily than in the past. And so we've sort of relied on in the United States on having our submarines be pretty undetectable and be able to operate with impunity in areas close to other people's countries. That is probably going to be coming to an end in the next 20 years or so, 10 to 20 years, with these new detection technologies. And while they won't necessarily give another country the ability to precisely target a submarine that's operating within a couple hundred miles of their coast, it can certainly give them an idea that that submarine might be there, and then they can go put some more ships or other assets on it to go locate it precisely and then harass it, or at least force it to go away, if not attack it outright.
Does it mean, or could it be fatal to the traditional idea of submarines? Will they have to be totally rethought, how they're built, how they operate?
Yeah, we definitely will need. It may not totally it may not totally change it, but it would certainly change how they operate and the missions that they do, and what we need to do with regard to unmanned vehicles to complement submarines. So in the future, we may find that submarines, instead of being sort of the fighter aircraft of the undersea world, if you will, where they go in and do operations directly themselves and get very close to the threat, they may have to operate more like an aircraft carrier, where they stay offshore to some distance to stay away from the threat, and then they deploy unmanned systems to go off, and unmanned vehicles or unmanned sensors will then go and do the job that the submarine used to do, that is much closer to the adversary's coast.
I'll come back to the concept of these unmanned killer drones, but what you're saying and the changes that are going to have to take place, how significant is that for a country like Australia, which is about to spend tens of billions of dollars possibly buying off-the-shelf submarines from somewhere like Japan or Germany? Are they likely to be prepared for this kind of warfare, this kind of change in strategy?
It's enormously important to that decision, because as you look forward and say in the 2020s is when this next class of submarines is intended to arrive, we're going to already see the advent of these new detection technologies. We're already going to have to start seeing a pull back in terms of where we can operate submarines safely or with impunity. And we're going to have to be deploying unmanned systems from submarines to get that last few hundred miles into the coast. So we need to think about submarine design in terms of the ability of the submarine to be a mothership or to be the host or command and control platform for a large group of unmanned systems, as opposed to the submarine being an independent platform that operates on its own without any other platforms along with it. So it changes the design of the submarine. They may have to be larger. They may have to incorporate a lot more communication equipment to be able to communicate undersea using variety of communication methods that are available. They may need to move away from traditional submarine missions like anti-submarine warfare towards more maybe unconventional missions like just being payload carriers or strike missions being their primary missions.
I've got to ask you the obvious question. Since you wrote this report for the Pentagon, have any Australian military planners been in contact with you? Because what you're saying has profound implications for any purchases.
Right. No, I haven't really been in contact with any Australian planners. I've talked to some people in Australia before, but none in the government. So I don't know yet whether the Australian government's looking at this trend as being something that should impact the design of the next class of submarines. But they certainly should, and I've certainly been in contact with the U.S. government in terms of what it might imply for how the next generation of U.S. submarines needs to evolve.
Let's talk about these unmanned armed drones, because many of them would carry, it seems seems to me, these small torpedoes which are being developed
Right.
quite for that purpose. I mean, doesn't it also mean that, let's say your adversary was a big country like China, for example, that they could not spend so much money on very expensive platforms like submarines, but spend a fortune on thousands of these armed drones to patrol their coast remotely?
Right. There's two big limitations with regard to what an unmanned undersea drone might be able to do. So one is endurance, because they have battery power, essentially. They might have a small diesel engine. And so even then, they're going to be operating relatively slowly, and they're not going to be able to go a long distance. So for the U.S. or Australia, they make a good adjunct or a complement to a manned submarine, which can have a much longer endurance. The other big limitation is they don't have any accountability in terms of the human control over weapons use. And so even though you could autonomously program this to go and shoot a torpedo at a target that it recognizes, who's going to be accountable for the result if that torpedo hits a civilian ship instead of hitting a military ship? So those are the two big limitations. And so what that'll mean is for the U.S. and Australia, we have to think about working the unmanned systems with the manned systems. So the man in the loop is there to be able to at least provide the decision-making accountability. But for a country like China, they could operate these much closer to their own coast. They don't have to worry about the endurance limitations. They may be less worried about the results if the unmanned drone strikes a civilian ship that's in their territorial waters, or at least in their EEZ. So they may be much freer with regard to the use of unmanned drones like this in areas like the South China Sea and East China Sea, where they feel like they're protecting their own territorial integrity.
Which, once again, would completely change your naval and indeed submarine strategy. Right. So it's a difficult one to deal with, because you actually have to look 10 or even 20 years ahead to the technology that's there. I mean, talk about the limitations of these drones. That's largely about battery power. Maybe in the future that won't be a problem.
Right. Something else to think about too is an unmanned drone is not going to be susceptible to the fear factor that a manned platform might be. So one limitation of a manned submarine is if you shoot at it, it generally has to run away because it doesn't have a lot of self-defense systems. It's not really fast, and it doesn't have very good situational awareness, or it doesn't have good sensors to be able to tell whether it's going to be hit or not. So you shoot at it, even if it's not going to be successful, the submarine has to leave. The unmanned drone will not respond in that way, and it'll continue to carry out the mission until you physically destroy it. So countering unmanned vehicles underwater is going to be a huge challenge, and that's something that I know the U.S. government's looking at, but I think that's something that all governments need to start looking at, is how are they going to counter the threat of unmanned drones from other countries.
Right, one last quick question. We're nearly out of time, but the U.S. Secretary of Navy says its next fighter jet to be developed will be an unmanned strike drone. Does that mean we're actually seeing the last generation now of U.S. Navy fighter pilots?
It may be. So there will continue to be U.S. manned pilots for manned aircraft that do other missions, but the idea, just like we see undersea, of the aircraft that's going to go the last few miles in to do a mission may have to be unmanned, just because the threat environment's going to be such that you need to have this aircraft be small and undetectable to the point where you may not want it to be manned, or you may want to swarm, like you mentioned in the great report that preceded the interview, that you may want to go to a swarm concept where you just send a lot of aircraft in to flood the enemy's defenses.
Bryan Clark, a lot to think about. We thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Well, all this talk of killer drones raises some very profound questions. For instance, are nations more likely to go to war if there's less risk of their civilians being killed? And what does it mean if you take human decision-making out of the loop? Can a machine tell the difference between a civilian and a combatant? Well, in 2012, the Obama administration issued a directive on the human oversight required for autonomous weapons systems. It prompted this headline in the magazine Wired.
Pentagon: a human will always decide when a robot kills you.
But the Pentagon denies there's a blanket ban on robots making their own decisions, while there will be oversight and a chain of command. If the right criteria is met, a machine could effectively operate on autopilot. So last month, a UN working group met to hear how nations should address the emerging reality of killer robots.
Allowing the world to move blindly in that direction is the start of another weapons revolution, if we want to look at it that way, that should never happen.
Well, Noel Sharkey is one of the scientists leading the global campaign to stop killer robots. He's the co-founder of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. He's also a professor of artificial intelligence at Sheffield University. He joins us now from Manchester in England. Thanks for being there, Noel Sharkey.
Hi, good to be here.
Now, that headline from Wired magazine, "A human will always decide when a robot kills you," is that essentially the kind of line in the sand which you would like to see set?
Yes, it is, but he's talking about the directive, the Department of Defence directive, which is an acquisitions directive, that's all. And it just says that appropriate levels of human judgment will always be used. And of course, appropriate levels could mean none. So we have to be careful about that.
Well, indeed. In fact, Wired actually misinterpreted the Obama directive, because the Pentagon, in fact, as we just heard, denies there's been a moratorium on building lethal autonomous weapons systems. What are the implications of that?
Well, there's so many implications. For a start, at the moment, it's been accepted now after a lot of campaigning that these weapons are not fit for purpose in terms of general use. They couldn't determine the difference between a civilian and a combatant, or civilian property and combatants. But nonetheless, people are discussing that they could be used in very narrow circumstances. For instance, to replace a cruise missile, something like the US X-47B, which can take off and land on aircraft carriers on its own, could be sent with a couple of $35,000 missiles on to take out a bridge rather than a $2 million cruise missile. But that's a sort of foot in the door, and they're not much good for discriminating anything else as yet. But you know, when people are talking about this, they tend to talk about it in a very narrow way. So when the US is talking about it, they're talking about getting a military edge because they've lost dominance in the missile field now. So they're talking now about getting a good edge on other countries. But these edges are very short-lived, just like the missile ones. So what happens when there's mass proliferation? What happens when there's an arms race? What happens when every big nation, every technological nation has these? We don't know how these systems will interact with each other. You were just talking about robot submarines, but what if other people have robot submarines? How will they interact together? And the answer to that is no one can possibly tell, and any computer scientist could tell you that.
Now, we have had autonomous weapons in a very rudimentary fashion for a very long time.
Yes.
Landmines,
Yes.
You could say, are the most rudimentary, or self-targeting machine guns that are activated by sensors. How are they different in moral terms to what we're talking about here?
Well, everything's on the table. I mean, anti-personnel landmines have been banned. And it's difficult to talk about them being autonomous any more than my doorbell is autonomous. I mean, they're a victim-activated explosive, really. You have to press the button and you get blown to pieces. An autonomous weapon is one that decides, where this decision is delegated to kill. Now, there are several that are around at the moment for, say, the Iron Dome in Israel, or the Patriot missile system, that are being used to shoot down missiles, essentially. So it's material objects. And those seem okay on the surface, but we really have to be careful. I mean, I read the fine print from manufacturers, like the German Mantis, which shoots down mortar shells, and that's fine. But it can also calculate exactly the source of that mortar fire, and that's where problems arise, because there might be civilians there instead of combatants, really. Okay. So we have to be very, very careful all the time.
Yeah, well, let's imagine a potential future where, and I guess we could look at it this way, landmines start rising up from the ground and flying around looking for people to blow up next to. I mean, that is effectively what a killer drone is, or what it could be. And now we hear they could come in swarms, they could be tiny, they could be as small as insects. What are the implications of that?
Well, again, it's this idea of if one swarm meets another swarm, what on earth happens? And we don't know what happens. I mean, very small ones are going to be, you know, they're going to have to deliver anthrax or something, which is totally illegal. You need a decent payload. But people are talking about having swarms of large ones as well, carrying missiles. So one of the things that the Center for New American Security is an US think tank, and one of their ideas is that to beat China, it's always about China in the Pacific, because the RAND Corporation report showed that China completely outguns the US in the Pacific, and they would have no chance there. So one of the ideas is to have swarms of these unmanned vehicles. And the thing about a swarm is, there's no way that anybody can control a swarm. You can send it in, you can look at what it's doing, you can call it back, but you could not look at individual targeting decisions. And I think it's very, very important that a human makes that decision. Only a human can really decide if an attack is proportional or not. That takes a human commander to think about what the military advantage is. And it's also the case that if you have these weapons and they swarm in, what happens when you lose communication with them? Now, people talk about having appropriate levels of human judgment, but one of the big things that's said over and over again in the US and other developed countries is that drones are no good because if you're fighting a sophisticated nation, the first thing they'll do is cut off communications. So the idea is that these vehicles or these weapons can complete a mission without a human communication. So if you've got no human communication, how on earth can you be in control of what it kills?
Yeah, Bryan, there's already a kind of debate around the very idea of meaningful control, that is human control effectively of a weapon system.
Yes.
Some experts are saying that autonomous versus semi-autonomous, there is no distinction between those two things. There's no real difference. What do you think about that? And how do you put laws around something as complex as this when the laws would have to be global and accepted by all countries?
Well, you just have to look at it. I mean, our job is to get the nations to get together and decide on these issues, to decide on what meaningful human control is. It certainly isn't just being able to veto like the Patriot missile system used in the Gulf Wars, where you have 5 seconds to press a button to say no. I mean, that's not what anybody would call meaningful human control. So this is all really under discussion. And it's not really for us to define it, because as soon as you define it, people will find flaws in it and try to get round it. But people at the United Nations are taking it very, very seriously. And it has to be clear when you're talking about semi-autonomy or autonomy or whatever, what we're talking about is not stopping autonomous robots in the military. I have no problem with that. I've spent my life building autonomous robots. What we've got a problem with is autonomy of the kill decision. So it's the delegation to the robot to kill, and that's what the problem is. So it will select the target and engage that target with lethal force or other force, and it could be sub-lethal, but even so, it's still not right.
Noel, we're nearly out of time, but will the laws have to encompass a future in which you not only have autonomous lethal weapons, but actually those carrying artificial intelligence in the future or controlled by artificial intelligence? Is that where the real science fiction element of this kicks in?
Well, artificial intelligence gets a funny sort of name because there's a kind of cultural thing about it made from science fiction. I mean, artificial intelligence generally is just hard-working stuff that makes your fridge work, that makes your car work, makes your cooker work. So I don't know, it doesn't need this kind of advanced self-aware system to be really dangerous. I mean, it's already very dangerous. Just ceding more and more decisions to machines is not a good thing without a lot of careful thought.
Noel Sharkey, we thank you very much for being there and for your passionate explanation of all of that. See you again.
Thank you.